Oh hey, welcome to yet another edition of Hand-Laid Tracks and 3D Printed Trains with Socrates. Today we're taking a retro look back a couple years ago when I first released a 9x12 curved turnout. Going to re-release it again, putting it on Colts this time, and you can print it yourself. It's got the tie beds to it, wires in the back, moved it forward so now all the wires are coming off the bottom, and you can check this video out. Made it a couple years ago when there was a lot less track work successfully laid and the wall was a lot quieter and I was a lot healthier. But check it out. Get the STL on Colts. Print up your own 9x12 curved jigs. It has all the various parts to cut the tie out. The biggest problem when you make your own hand-laid tracks is the little tiny ties. They all have to be gapped in the middle, otherwise you'll get a short across the rails. And putting that little gap in the right place, that is really annoying fiddly work. So I made a little jig, holds all the ties in the right place, and you can go ahead and quickly gap them. Check out the video from some years ago and get yourself jigs to make your own curved turnouts. Curved turnouts is super cool. Thanks for watching. Oh hey, welcome to another edition of Hand-Laid Tracks and 3D Printed Trains with Socrates. Today we're taking a look at a 12x9 curved turnout. This is something I designed and built myself with a 3D printer. It's based off the Fast Tracks concept, except this is actually a 9-inch curve with a 12-inch diverging rail. Normally it would be a 12-inch curve with a 9-inch diverging rail. And the main difference is that if you put this into a set of 9-inch curves, the main track will be consistent with the 12-inch diverging off of it. I printed up a bunch of different 3D printed items to help me do the whole process. I made some jigs that go around to hold the whole pieces in place, and also a frog cutter and a point cutter. So this cuts the frog and point rails, and it cuts both of them at the same time, the left and the right, and you put them all in there at once, and pretty much it makes the whole job of cutting the ties a whole lot easier, or cutting the rails a whole lot easier. And to make the tie cutting easier, I built a tie cutter and gapper. I already have ties in here, trying not to drop them out. But the first thing you do is you put the cut ties into length here, and you snip them off the length and quickly file the top, and then you put the same ties into the secondary piece, which slips inside. Now they're secured, and you can see them through the windows, and you can see that none of them have been cut. So you can run a quick file, a triangle file through there. You cut the gaps in it because you have to gap all the copper ties, otherwise you'll end up with the dead short. You then pop out the diverging rails, and in this case I added an extra long one as well, and you put them into here for a second cut. You can see that the first gap has been made or not made. You make sure you have them facing the right side up, and then you gap the second gap, and on the one diverging rail there's always a third gap, and in this case I added a second one with 3 gaps. So this way, gapping the rail or the ties is quick, easy, and very precise, because it's a very difficult job to do by hand, and it's really hard to do accurately by hand. And these little jigs make that much easier. And then just like that, you'll end up with a piece of built-up track with your ties gapped, set in position, diverging rails in place. The frogs have been soldered together. This is all ready to be soldered together. And the way I do it is I do the outside rails first, and then the diverging and the frog rails, and eventually you'll end up with a full turnout. I also print the tie beds to go on the back of it, and you end up with a quick, nice 12-inch by 9-inch curved end scale turnout. Hand built, hand designed, handmade. Hopefully it works. And this is a quick video of me building it, chatting about the process. You can download all the various things I just showed and print them up yourself in the 3D printer and make yourself some hand-laid tracks. Love to see what you guys make. Like, subscribe, watch the rest of the video, and enjoy me chatting about building a track. Talk to you soon. So this is the building of the 12x9 curved turnout, and I start with the straight track and the rail roller tool, another tool available on Thingiverse. And in this case, you have to build one stock rail to a 12-inch curve and the other stock rail to a 9-inch curve. So the one half of the curved turnout, basically, because it's basically 2 pieces of curved tracks interacting. So you build one rail to each side, and then cut that rail up into a stock rail a diverging rail and a frog rail, and also eventually a guard rail. And you do the same thing with the other rail for the other side, and then you end up with all your parts for the turnout. And to do the frog and the point and the diverging points, I use the frog cutout tool, and you just treat them like they were straight track. And I used my own frog and point cutter does both rails at once. You put them back to back, so it's the flat to the flat and the rail heads that way, and they both slide in at once, and then you file them both at the same time. And even though they're curved, you basically just sort of force them in there. It can straighten the rail a little bit, so you sort of hand curve it back into full curved shape again. And then in this case I'm doing the frogs. I use my Fast Trax jig for a lot of this, although I just recently printed up a little jig to do the frogs. This would go on top of the rail, still using the Fast Track metal underneath it, and this was another way to do the frogs. And then the next thing is cutting out the ties. And again, I really love this thing because this is the hardest task to do by hand. If anyone's done it, they'll tell you. But the tool makes it really easy. First, snip all the different ties to length and put them into the outside of the into the case. And basically, you want to snip it and then file back that second edge. So you put it in once, snip it, flip it, put it in again, and snip it, and then that little last piece you throw away. And eventually, you fill up the whole thing with your ties, and then with a quick file, you sand them all to length, and then they basically move from the bottom jig into the top jig, and the top jig is the one that cuts the gaps into it, and this is me moving them from the one jig to the other. And once they're in there, it just snaps into place, and they have a little window if they get stuck so you can push them out. Snaps it into place, and then you hit it with the filing with the triangle file, and you cut the gaps into it. I think took me a little time to get the extra ones done. Yeah, I think I was short one. Anyway, now it's ready for gapping, and I hit it with the triangle tool. And I found on my tool only one edge works very well, so I mark it and I always use the same edge. And in this case, I'm doing that second turnout, the second gap with in that one jig. The jig I showed earlier is actually for a different turnout. I'm just realizing I showed this one, which is for the 15 by 9 that I'm working on now. The 12 by 9 has a double system like that, which is same basic idea. They go in the outside first and then the inside, and then you slip them out of the tie gapper once they've all been gapped, and make sure you're putting them in the right direction, and they slowly go into the jig itself. And again, this is one of the hardest tasks to do by hand, and the single hardest thing is to get that third gap in the proper place. But I found that with this system, they're pretty much exactly where I want them to be. And again, when you can't quite get the ties out, there's a little window on the back to push on, and it'll let you pull the actual ties out. I then make sure they're all pushed into the square corner, because the jig has a rounded corner and a squared corner, and the rounded corner is easier to leverage it out. So I add all the rails, and I make sure everything's in position before I do soldering. So I try to check all the rails are in alignment and engaged, and then I'll start doing one of the two outside stock rails. I do the one on the side that has the circles on it, because that way the soldering iron tends to push the tie more into the gap. That way they're all the way down into the square end of my jigs. And then I tend to start in the middle, making sure that it's engaged. And again, I just do the one rail at a time and slowly go along it. I add a little bit of solder, and then I add pressure and heat it with a second time with the soldering iron, because again, you don't want to put too much heat on the jig, because it will melt. And so I try to put a little tiny bit of solder on the tip of the soldering iron, and then I touch that down and add a little bit more solder, and then take it off as quick as possible, add my pressure and reheat it a second time, and then go all the way around it. And eventually you've got one half the main turnout done. At this point, I've got the outside rail done. So again, the little T gauges make sure it's engaged. So I'm constantly making sure that the gauge is there. This was a mistake. I should not have done the frog just there. I had to loosen it up later on in the build. I just do the two outer stock rails. Now at this point, I've done the one side, so I'm doing the second side. I used to solder from both ends, but I find it's just easier to just flip the jig and only work from the easy side. But now the rails are all in position and they can't really go anywhere. So it's a lot easier to do it without worrying about moving things. You don't have to check on your gap anymore, because make sure that that third gap is in the right place before you solder the rails. Make sure all the gaps are in the right place, but that third gap is the only one that is so difficult to get in the right position that you really, really want to make sure you have it in the right place. And I also clean the soldering iron tip off. You can't really see it, but basically between most of these things, I'll go ahead and wipe it off on the sponge. And once you've, it's the same basic process, starting in the middle of that other stock rail and just moving down bit by bit, constantly making sure that the gauge is correct. And on the curve, you use the one stock rail and the one diverging rail, and part of it you use this one stock rail and the frog rail. So have to put them all in proper place, have them all formed first, and you can see, making sure that it all still sort of works. And where it doesn't work, I'm trying to move things in such a way that they do work. And this can take a little while. I take my time with this. I try to make sure that everything's working as clean as possible. The guardrails will help later on, but if it's the best it can be, it's logically going to be the best it can possibly be. And at this point, again, I probably should have done the diverging rails first, and I think that the best would be to do the diverging rail, because to get through the frog cleanly using the little coupler back and forth, the one that I have the hardest time with is the diverging track. So I'm trying to do the diverging side first and then go and do the straight rail. At this point, this one worked out fairly well, as you can see. But once you've got, in this case I think I did the frogs first, and now I'm doing the diverging rails. But I basically make sure I get one spot down and make sure I'm really happy with it, because if you have to lift it off from one spot, it's not that hard. But if you have to lift off every one, it's not impossible, but it really does damage a lot of things, including potentially the jig if you're doing it inside the jig. But I'm getting through the process of adding all the individual solder joints for the frogs and the diverging rails. And one of the things that's important about doing this as quickly, if you like, with as little heat as possible. I mean, if you destroy the jig, it's no big deal, but you still have to get the part out of the jig, and that gets, the harder, the worse you solder, the harder it gets to pull it out. I use a little tiny, I think it's like a 2mm flat screwdriver, and sort of wedge it into the circle ends, and I find that you can kind of just a little bit at a time in a couple places, and then eventually you slip it all the way in, and then you can more or less pop it out. But the worse you're soldering and the slower you do the soldering, by far that's going to make it the worse you're going to have it coming out. And you don't do all the diverging rails, but you do a couple of them to make sure that they're secured. And again, just checking to make sure the thing works. Kind of hard to fix it now, but not impossible. You certainly don't have to. And at that point, you've mostly got a turnout. And the one last thing to cut out was the guardrails. Again, I used curved rails for that. I find it easiest to use the fast track jig to bend a little bend into it. You can actually use the end of one of these jigs, works as well, but it's easier just to use the fast tracks because I already have it. I also use the fast tracks point and fog tools as weights. I use my own cutters now, but I do still use them as weights. And once the individual guardrails have been cut and shaped, you have to put a little angle into the end of them, which is a really nice thing about making your own tracks, is that you can flare the end of the diverging rails and the end of the guardrails, and it makes a nice smooth entry point for the wheels to go through the flange. And again, now soldering these on is a bit tricky because they want to wiggle around so much, so I find putting just one piece, and again just adding a little bit of solder and then using the metal track gauge to gauge it and press it at the same time. It allows you to solder in place and hold it in place at the right spot. You know, it doesn't have to be exact, but it certainly shouldn't interfere with the wheels, because then you'll have a major problem from the whole thing. And that's the last thing that has to be soldered on, and the trucks tend to be even better with the wheels on. They didn't show me removing it. And then once you have to take it out, and you put another piece of PCB tie board in between the rail and the stock rail and diverging rail. It gives you the little gap that you need, and the piece of paper keeps you from soldering to the rail. and then you can solder the diverging rail onto the moving throw bar. And here I forgot to use the paper, but I got away with it. And you have then a moving turnout. The last thing to do is to reinforce the frog. And I also like to do it a little bit because I'm going to have to put a feeder wire goes in that same place. And so I put a little bit of solder there to get where the feeder wire is going to go after that. And you solder it in the end because the feeder wire is going to come down through the back so you can put power to the frog, because you end up having to cut a small tiny slot. I use a jeweler's saw, and between the double ties you have to cut to isolate the frog. That way your gaps are on the outside and that triple gap is in here, and there's another small gap in there, and that isolates the frog. So when you switch directions, because as the frog goes this way, this is the positive side and the negative side, for example, but then it comes over here. Now this is going from negative rail to the positive rail. It's just something you have to do with turnouts when you swip them back and forth if you have a powered frog, and this does in fact have a powered frog. So that's the 12x9 hand-laid turnout, 3D printed parts. Get your things on Thingiverse, make yourself a turnout. Check it out, like it, subscribe it, etc., etc. It's getting there slowly. Thanks for watching. See you next time. That's it. Nothing else. Hand-laid tracks didn't have the theme song back then, but now I don't have a theme song back now. Doesn't have a theme song still. Ha ha!